topic tonight is obviously of enormous interest. Kosovo searching for an honorable exit, and we hope the search won't go on too much longer. Our guest, Mr. Clarke, is a graduate of Oxford University. It's not unimportant that he majored in ancient Greek and Latin. He's a former career diplomat in the British Foreign Diplomatic Service. In London, he worked on issues related to China, South Africa, and Central America. His particular areas of expertise are political, economic, and development issues relating to Europe, particularly the future of European security, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, the United States, and East Asia. He's a writer, lecturer, and consultant on international issues. He's also president of the American Journalism Foundation. He writes a regular syndicated column for the Los Angeles Times. He's a fellow at the Cato Institute and is affiliated with the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. His writings have been widely published. He's had regular commentaries for the BBC, National Public Radio, Canadian Broadcasting Service, and you may have well seen him on major network and public TV programs. Let me just comment on his writings briefly because they indicate his range of substantive interests over the past half a dozen years and probably much longer. But his co-authored book was entitled After the Crusade, American Foreign Policy for the Post-Superpower Age. And in September of '93, he published an article which was one of the earliest serious considerations of the foreign policy of the new administration, an analysis which he entitled The Intellectual Poverty of American Foreign Policy. He's contributed to Foreign Affairs, writing on Bosnia, Foreign Policy on replacing NATO, American leadership and the transatlantic relationship, in National Interest on Republican foreign policy, morality in foreign policy, and interestingly, especially I think, post-Cold War rhetoric, in Orbis on APEC and Asian security. He's written on alternatives to NATO, the United States and future Bosnias, and in the Journal of Strategic Studies on beckoning quagmires, NATO in Eastern Europe. The topics, I think, are absolutely applicable to this evening. We're delighted that he's willing to be with us and share with us his knowledge and his thoughts. It's my great pleasure to present to you Mr. Jonathan Clarke.
Thank you very much indeed for that kind introduction and for your warm welcome tonight. Talking about warm, you may know that the British Diplomatic Service used to receive a tropical allowance for being in Washington. But I mean to say, this is ridiculous, isn't it? I also understand that I'm your fourth speaker on Kosovo in the recent past, so I will try to say something new about this infinitely varied subject. While I was putting this talk together about 10 days ago, of course, the war was still going on, and as one of the doubters, I felt that things were going my way. But right now, I feel a bit like the artist Frederick Remington, who was sent down to Cuba in 1898 by William Randolph Hearst, and to report on the war there. And he cabled back that there wasn't a war going on. And you remember Hearst's famous reply, "You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war." But in a sense, I also feel slightly constrained about talking because of having been on the doubting side of this issue. Suddenly, peace has broken out, and there has been an apparent victory for the side about which I was raising questions. Now, if you were sort of scoring this on a soccer scale, you might say the naysayers had 0 and the war party had 6. Now, of course, we all love sports analogies. They give a clarity to the situation. They give a winner and a loser, which we all want to have and we're all looking for in this very complex situation. But unfortunately, I think we all know that life, and particularly international diplomatic life, is not like a sports analogy. It is, in fact, very, very much more complex. And I think that if we head off in that direction of looking for winners and losers, we're going to learn some of very inapplicable lessons from this situation. So I would just like, if you don't mind, to take a few moments to let you know where my doubts were, what I was saying, and particularly what I was not saying. And I think it's, I'd like to say first that I never really doubted that NATO, a huge organization, 600 million people, the most advanced weaponry ever assembled on the face of the earth. I never had any doubt that this huge organization would be able to bring a nation of 11 million people who had been subjected to sanctions for well over a decade, that it would not be able to bring that people to heel. I also thought, probably, that bombing would have that effect. It would be able to subdue a relatively small country. And I think essentially that is what has happened. But what I was really saying was I did not think that war was the appropriate instrument to address the underlying issue in the region. And I think that thesis still is valid. We look at the war, and we have to remind ourselves that on March the 24th, the day that the bombing started, there were some terrible, terrible things happening inside Kosovo. But the huge humanitarian disaster had not happened. We will never know whether it was foreordained to happen or whether somehow the bombing commencement set the stage for Milosevic to unleash something he would have done anyway. But the humanitarian disaster, I think, should caution us against claiming too open a victory here. I think there are other side effects here. The damage to regional stability. We look particularly, I think, at Macedonia, at Montenegro, and even at Albania. The situation in those countries, I think it's going to take a long time to get back to normal, if it ever does. And we have to keep a very open eye on the situation in Macedonia. I believe that the damage to geostrategic relationships with Russia and China is going to take a long time to heal. You probably heard the assertion of one senior Russian that the Communist Party in Russia spent the whole Cold War trying to turn the Russian people against the American people and never succeeded. And his claim was that that is what the bombing in Serbia had done. True or not, I believe that there has been lasting damage to that part of the world. And I also think that the war has perhaps revealed something slightly uncomfortable about ourselves. It has shown that we are willing to inflict huge damage and destruction on a part of the world which represented no immediate threat to ourselves. It has shown that NATO is willing to transform itself away from its original defensive role into taking action outside its natural boundaries. And I think that is going to be something that we're going to have to live with over the coming years and decades. But most of all, even if you don't agree with what I've been saying now, the war has not addressed the underlying problem it was intended to do. Now, what is this underlying problem? Now, it's a commonplace among Europeans that Americans don't study history enough. It's probably also a commonplace among many Americans that Europeans bang on too much about history and treat history as though it was a sort of determinist study. And of course, the truth lies somewhere between the two. There's nothing more boring than the Balkan historian who thinks he knows a little bit more Balkan history than you do and always brings up the extra fact which trumps your case. So I'm not going to wade too much into history, but I do think that we have to understand a little bit about what the underlying problem is. And it is two very different stories. Let us start looking at it from the Serb side of the story. And I'm going to give the Albanian side of the story later. Two very, very different stories. The Serb side of the story is that in the 8th or 9th century, as the people started to flow down from the north of Europe, they found essentially an empty land around Kosovo and started to build their religious sites, which now date from the 10th and 11th century in that part of the world. This was the part of the world where they formed their national and religious and historical identity, associated, I'm sure, as you all know, with the famous Battle of Kosovo in 1389, when Prince Lazar, who was offered this one rather romantic choice between inheriting the heavenly kingdom through defeat or inheriting the earthly kingdom through victory, chose the heavenly kingdom. And this is this national myth. I mean, I think most historians do admit that is a myth. But this is the national myth which is impregnated into every Serb. They see this part of the world as something which is really inalienable from them, or if it is ripped away from them, somehow will be taking away their identity. They see themselves having, over the past hundreds of years, served as the bulwark of Christendom against the Ottoman Empire, and then more recently, in both World War I and World War II, as fighting upon the Allied side, upon the American side, once again at a time when the people around them, the Croats, the Albanians, were, as they see it, on the other side. Now, in about World War II, Kosovo starts to come unstuck from a Serb point of view. Up until about that time, there was a Serb majority inside Kosovo, but in World War II, when Kosovo was under Italian protection, the Albanian population started moving in there and started a trend which would never be reversed from the Serb point of view. After World War II, at the beginning of communism, the balance was already 1-3 in the Albanian favor. And what they see throughout the Tito years was a deliberate attempt, or deliberate efforts made by Tito to keep the Serbs down, to keep them in check, to take away their privileges, and to give extra privileges to the Kosovo Albanian side. And this is something which is very deep in their hearts, this sense of victimhood, and a victimhood which portrays itself very large and clearly on Kosovo. Remember, I'm talking simply from the Serb point of view. For every fact I bring up here, there is a contrary fact, which I should perhaps go into right now. The Albanian point of view is quite different. They say, far from being empty when the Serbs arrived, in fact, this part of the world was already populated by the ancestors of the Albanian people, the Illyrians, and that if you look on medieval maps, the name Albania is already plain to see, and that the Albanians were well established in this part of the world, and it's really the Serbs who are the invaders. They're the ones who have taken away the land which was already occupied by the Albanians. Now, none of this matters very much, but in the 19th century, the weakening of the Ottoman Empire gave Albanian nationalism an opportunity to assert itself. In 1878, just before the Congress of Berlin, the Albanians formed their National League in Prizren, which was there to assert the cause of pan-Albanian nationalism, that all Albanians living in that area should be united into one state, self-determination, something that was just about to burst on the world. They then argue that it was the Serbs who fought against these legitimate aspirations. In the communist years, they were given a measure of autonomy under Tito, but this was not enough. It was independence they wanted, and this was kept away from them essentially by the Serbs. When Tito died, Milosevic came onto the scene in 1987, as you know, made that famous speech at Kosovo, saying that he would no longer allow the Serbs to be kicked around by the Albanians, and thereby launched the process which would strip away autonomy from the Albanians and would make it clear to them that there was no living with the Serbs and that independence was the only way forward. Now, what you're seeing here really, therefore, are two conflicting claims. On the one hand, you have the Serbs asserting history, and on the other hand, you have the Albanians asserting essentially demography. They are by far the largest part of the population. Whether it is 90% before the bombing started, nobody knows, but it's certainly an overwhelming majority. Now, these two claims, the United States sometimes favors one, sometimes favors the other. For example, the Israeli claim to the West Bank on the basis that it's the historical Judea and Samaria, we don't go along with. Demography sometimes also we don't fully endorse. Cyprus, for example, the Greek Cypriots are 80% of the population, but we still think that the Turkish Cypriots ought to have a measure of autonomy, of self-government. So, it's not an easy situation. The Serb assertion is that there is a ready solution, which is that if the Albanians want self-determination, they've got a country, Albania, they can go to that. The Albanian assertion is quite the opposite. They say, no, we're here, we want independence. So, completely, as I say, conflicting claims. Now, if we look at that, what does it mean for us standing on the outside of this particular range of conflicting assertions? Firstly, I think we have to recognize that this is a problem which has extremely deep roots. And I'm not just asserting here the sort of cliche that you've all heard about the ethnic Balkan animosities. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about something which really goes very, very deep into history, and something which we can't just look at from today's point of view. It's not something which has popped up over the last 10 years. It goes back a great deal further than that. Not to be determinist about it, just to be objective that this is what we need to be thinking about. Secondly, this is a fundamental conflict. It's not a conflict about nothing. It's about land. It's about history. It's about religion. It's about national identity. These are not something which somebody has just made up. These are just not mischievous assertions by one party or the other. These are very, very real human feelings. They're very, very, very real physical feelings in terms of ownership of the land. So, once again, the seriousness of the problem has got to be kept in front of us. Thirdly, I think that we have to recognize that the problem we're talking about transcends the personalities of the day. We've tended to say that Milosevic is the prime cause, almost the only cause of what has happened here. Of course, he bears a lion's share of the responsibility. And I would assert until somehow we manage his exit from the scene, we're going to be dealing with a continuing unstable situation. But nonetheless, it's not all about him. He's not the only actor on the stage here. The personalities involved are not really the key issue. We have got to look at this fundamental, underlying antagonism, contrary claims between the two parties. And I think the other thing which is, in fact, right before our eyes, that there is no obvious solution to this. The French, who are tremendous diplomatic theoreticians, have even come up and have admitted there isn't even a solution in theory for Kosovo, let alone one in practice. And if the French say that, that really is saying something. I mean, we could all, I think, sit in this room for hours and days, and nobody would really come up with a satisfactory theoretical solution for the problem in front of us. Now, so much, that's rather a gloomy assessment. On the other hand, I think there are also some other aspects to this problem. One of which is that, in a sense, the Kosovo problem is actually pretty typical. There are other situations rather like this around the world. Northern Ireland, from my country, obviously springs to mind. You have the same conflicting claims, you have the same historical animosity, you have the same economic tensions, you have the interaction of religion. I think the Middle East is another case in point, where you have the same type of factors in operation. So in other words, Kosovo is not completely a one-off. It's not a freak. There are other examples of this sort of situation around the world. And I say that because just to, I think, give us some cheer that if we've been able to bring some form of resolution, or at least a way of living in peace to other problems, perhaps we can do the same in Kosovo. And I'd also say that another fundamental aspect of it is that the problem is essentially political. I think we made a mistake in treating it as a security problem rather than a political problem. I mean, it's a problem between peoples, and that those sort of problems are typically political rather than anything else. So I think that's where we should keep our focus, is on the political side of things. And I think the other thing we have to remind ourselves as outsiders is that we're not involved in this situation in the normal way of international relations. I mean, Jim Baker had that famous phrase as the Bosnia tragedy started. He said, we do not have a dog in that fight. Now, even if you don't agree with that, and many people don't, I think we have to acknowledge that the involvement of outsiders in here is not in the same way as, for example, you are involved in a situation where you are under direct threat from an outside power. Serbia is not directly attacking us. Obviously, the ability of Serbia to project power against the United States is very close to zero. And that probably goes for most of the other actors in the Kosovo conflict. We're not involved there for our own national security reasons because of a direct threat to us, which I think should send a signal to us that something a little bit different is going on, and perhaps a warning signal, because after all, when other people have raised that sort of the right to interfere for reasons other than defense of national security. For example, the Russians, in their assertions about the near abroad as the Soviet Empire broke up, we were very unhappy. As Roosevelt asserted the Roosevelt corollary for the on the Monroe Doctrine, Europeans were extremely worried that the United States, as it were, asserted a first right to interfere in Latin America against the European interests. So the idea that there's somehow there is this legitimate right, I think, is something which is being debated right now in international circles. But it's something I think we have to remind ourselves is slightly odd. It's something we're breaking new ground here. It's not something which is absolutely foreordained as a good thing. Now, putting all that together, how do I think we've sort of responded to that, to the challenges in front of us, and where do I think we're going to be going from here? Well, being on, as I've already said, on the doubting side, I'm going to talk about what I call 3 key mistakes. You may not think they are mistakes, but to my mind they are. They have been, because I think we've taken a situation which was certainly very complex, certainly extremely challenging, and I think we've handled it poorly, and we've made the situation a lot worse for a lot of the people concerned. I think perhaps our first error is that we've hyped the whole Balkan history, the whole Balkan story has somehow been, we've treated it as more important than it really is. Certainly, there's some fascinating aspects about the Balkan. I think it's sort of rather like this generation's Spanish Civil War. You have these very clear delineations between perhaps good and evil, and it's a very attractive arena for people to exercise their ideological differences. But I think, in a sense, we've let it grow a little bit bigger than it really is, and the hype has led us into rhetoric which goes far beyond, has gone far beyond the action that we were actually prepared to take. In the early days of Bosnia, we were talking, or very soon we were talking, as though this was a sort of paradigm challenge to Western civilization at the end of the Cold War, and I really don't think it was that. I mean, it was a human tragedy, but it was something which, had it been handled in a slightly less intense way, would, I think, have been handled a great deal better. Second major mistake, in my view, is that by treating this not as a political challenge, but as a security challenge, we brought in precisely the wrong organization, namely NATO. NATO, as you all know, is a war-fighting machine, awesome power, constituted to keep the Soviet Union at bay, and did so extremely successfully. I have to confess to being a Cold War warrior. One of my jobs in the British diplomatic service was to go out there and to advocate the benefits of NATO. When, for example, we were facing a very difficult situation like the Euromissile crisis in the mid-1970s. So those are the sort of things that I believe NATO was absolutely ready for and performed admirably, but it was the wrong institution, the wrong approach to be used in these essentially political, people-to-people problems at the end of the Cold War. Had we raised the political content of this, I think we would have played this thing very differently. And I think the last strategic error we made, and once again this is going to be controversial, is that we took sides. Instead of being a traditional honest broker, as the United States is, and I think should have been in international disputes, we somehow found ourselves endorsing one side against the other side. Now, I think this is perfectly reasonable for individuals to do. Obviously, people do have very strong feelings about the fact that, for example, the Bosnian Muslims received atrocious treatment from Milosevic, or that the same applied to the Kosovo Albanians. That is, I think, fine for individuals. I don't believe that the United States as a country should have done that. I think it would be much better to have played the role of honest broker. It's not to say that one couldn't be leaning to one side or another. This is precisely what the United States does in the Middle East peace negotiations. But it does still retain, I think, at least a sense of confidence from both sides. This did not happen in this particular decade of conflict in the Balkans, and I think that was a pity. Now, the results of these three mistakes, I think, were very disadvantageous for a proper settlement of the underlying issues. Firstly, it led us into, I think, a tremendous overcommitment of credibility. When I wrote my book after the Crusade, of course, the Crusade was the Cold War, and I was slightly assuming that crusading was going to be out of fashion in the post-Cold War age. But in fact, it's exactly what we've done. We've gone into a crusading mentality where we have put our credibility time and time again on the line. And because our rhetoric has been in front of our willingness to take decisive action, that credibility has constantly come into question. And so we've been forced into the argument that we had to do something simply to reinforce our credibility. Not because it would be advantageous to the settlement, but because it was somehow associated with our credibility. And I think that was a pity. I mean, if you look at the Rambouillet talks, this was a classic example, I think, where it was the talks were conducted against a deadline. Why a deadline, I don't know. There was no immediacy about, at least no immediacy for 2 weeks or a month about the issue there. There was a deadline. There was the constant invocation of the threat of force. And somehow we got ourselves into a position where we had to go to war simply for those reasons, if for no other reasons. And I think that was a tremendous shame. The use of NATO. I think this has done, significant damage to NATO as an alliance. Once again, if you have a NATO, if Jamie Shea were here, he would not be agreeing with this particular line of argument. But I think that this has exposed NATO in a variety of ways. Firstly, I think it has exposed NATO not as the omnipotent defensive power that we'd all assumed that it was. It's after all taken us 73, 74 days of fairly intensive high-tech bombing of a very, very small country, as I mentioned before, to bring that country to heel. And even so, the argument really is still open. I think that in itself has exposed NATO for, in a sense, a little bit of a paper tiger. And I think we'll all come to regret that if we have much more serious challenges, which I'm sure do lie ahead. Secondly, I think it has shown that the NATO cohesiveness is something which is a very fragile plant. It's not just the people like the Greeks who were having severe difficulties with what was going on. There were tremendous strains inside the German coalition. The Hungarians, the Czechs, all were seeing themselves subjected to very surprising demands upon them. So I think the cohesiveness of NATO just survived, but only by the skin of its teeth. Obviously, the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, I think, also exposed the myth, really, about aerial bombardment and how precise it is and how it's going to be able to deliver that required immediate victory to you. I think that's once again been exposed. And most of all, I think that the transformation of NATO from a defensive alliance into an alliance which is now shown itself ready to go outside its borders and take action against a state which has not attacked it, is going to send a signal quite different from the one that we want to send. It's not going to send a signal that dictators, you'd better watch out. It's going to send a signal that it's going to indicate that NATO, you had better watch out, because if you step out of line, NATO is going to be after you. And other countries, the major countries, are going to say, we had better prepare against that. Particularly, I think, Russia is the case in point. So that's what those are the difficulties I see on the NATO side. Now, the question of taking sides and abandoning the role of being an honest broker, I think that had a very odd effect. And what it essentially did, it was to radicalize both sides of this equation. The Serbs saw that they could not win an argument by normal argumentation, raising facts. So they just said, well, we're out of the picture, we have to do the best we can by ourselves, which I think tended to cut them off from rational international argumentation, people being able to talk to them. They just thought, well, the West is against us, there's no point. I think on the other side, you also saw a flight towards the radicals, and we've seen particularly, I think, the Kosovo Liberation Army significantly gaining in influence and strength because of a willingness, in a sense, to endorse the more extreme demands on the Albanian side, which cut the ground away from what is really a very significant moderate element, or was a significant moderate element on the Kosovo-Albanian side, and which is no longer there. I think it's no longer a viable force, although I hope we're going to be able to get back onto that. So I think the radicalization by this abandonment of the honest broker role, I think, was once again an unfortunate mistake that we're going to be paying for some time. Now, where do we stand today, and where are we going from? Now, I think we've got to sort of sort out our images in our mind. And I think, for starters, Kosovo is not Bosnia. Whenever you hear somebody saying we've got to learn the lessons of Bosnia, you better tune out, because it's simply not the same thing. In Bosnia, the various sides had essentially fought each other to a standstill. They had war fatigue. In fact, since really almost since 1992, the front lines, the military front lines in Bosnia had been reasonably static. They were just simply warred out. Nothing else to be said about it. And this is not the case in Kosovo. As I said, the underlying argument, the conflicting claim, has not been settled at all. Nor, I think, is it World War II, where we had a complete surrender of Germany and Japan. We were able to move into Germany, reconstruct the country, denazify, new constitution, etc., etc. I don't think we're dealing with World War II now. Serbia has not and does not perceive itself to be defeated in that way. I think it's probably much more like World War I. The Serbian people see that they have certainly been defeated, just like the German people saw that they've been defeated in World War I, but don't really accept it as a legitimate defeat. They see themselves as having suffered that stab in the back, as the Germans did in World War I. They thought they'd been stabbed in the back by the generals who had abandoned fighting too soon. I think many Serbs think that they've been stabbed in the back by the Russians, and that therefore somehow their defeat is not really ingrained in on them. This is simply a tactical retreat, and for perhaps a jump forward a little later on. Now, this leaves us with a number of scenarios that we're going to have to work out and work through over the coming months, and I hope not years, but I strongly suspect so. I think the first one, which is the most likely, I think, is that the West is going to turn itself into the new version of the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and really of the Titoist Empire. We're going to have to be there for a very significant length of time. We're going to have to administer really quite small details of the administration. We're going to have to rebuild bridges, water supply plants, electricity generators. We're going to have to provide oversight of the police, the judiciary, education for, I think, a very large number of years. I think that's what's going to most likely lie ahead of us. I guess this is going to give new opportunities for old imperialists like myself. I was born and brought up in Hong Kong, so I suppose that the British Raj perhaps will rise once again in Kosovo. That's one aspect. I mean, I think that's going to have to happen anyway. Now, underneath that administration, what might happen? Firstly, on the positive side, I think you would hope you get national reconciliation. You hope that the refugees will go back, that they will, after a period of time, resume their normal lives. You hope that a number of Serbs will stay on in Kosovo. Those who have fled will come back, and somehow that they will resume their normal lives, obviously not immediately, but over the long term, and that somehow the Western administration of the territory enables the peoples there to live together in relative harmony, and hopefully also that this is accompanied by democratization and economic reform inside Serbia itself, which lends a much more benign climate to the situation. I think that's the optimistic scenario. And on the negative side, what you're going to find is the possible guerrilla attacks from one side or the other, and I don't rule out either from the Kosovo Albanian or from the Serb side, on what will be seen as occupying forces by the Serbs, and perhaps as increasingly oppositional forces by the Kosovo Albanians. This is precisely what happened in Northern Ireland. You remember the British troops initially went into Northern Ireland to protect the Catholic population. They were welcomed with cups of tea by Catholic ladies in Belfast. But it wasn't very long until people realized that what in effect the British Army in Northern Ireland was doing was protecting the status quo, and thereby encouraged the IRA to start taking pot shots at British soldiers there. And that's perhaps what's going to happen from one side or the other in Kosovo. I certainly hope not. Where do I think we need to put our emphasis in the coming months? I think we've got to do really two major areas of work. The first thing is we have got to, if possible, bring about a change of government in Belgrade. So long as you have this dysfunctional, pathological regime in Belgrade, the risks for regional stability are going to be very, very severe indeed. Milosevic, I think, is widely accepted to be a person interested really only in his own personal power. That's why he is there. It's not because he is a particular nationalist. He gave away Bosnia without a second thought. He is interested in self-preservation, and he thrives on conflict. He thrives on stimulating difficulties, where it puts him center stage and makes him the man who the West has got to deal with. Obviously, the indictment of him as a war criminal certainly complicates his calculations in that regard, because he's going to be much more difficult for the West to deal with in the future. But that's where he's coming from, and I think it's until we somehow remove him, get the Serbian people to remove him from the scene, we're going to be facing an uphill slog in Kosovo. How you're going to do that? Now, I think precisely the wrong way to do this is going to be to try and somehow freeze Serbia off from development aid, development and assistance aid, which obviously is going to be flowing into the region. If you do that, I think it's going to play into Milosevic's hands. It's going to enable him to say, well, look, the West is still against us. All we are left with is our own devices. We've got to hunker down. So I think we've got to somehow draw Serbia into the mainstream. I think we've got to do that, I'm afraid, by extending some form of olive branch to Serbia, rebuilding, reconstruction aid. Part of this is for very good practical reasons, that the economy of the region really doesn't function unless the transportation can go out through Belgrade and up the Danube. So bridges will have to be built, railroad lines will have to be relayed, and so on. I think that gives a good rationale for at least some of the reconstruction aid to be given to Serbia. I also think we need to make much more common cause with the Serbian opposition movements, which do exist. There are decent Serbs, they're weak, they're divided, but nonetheless they, I think, are worthy of support, and if the United States can stand up with them somehow, they are going to get a shot in the arm, and I think this is the opportunity now to move in that direction, to bring about fundamental regime change in Belgrade. I think the second leg of what we have to do is we have to look very closely at the Kosovo Liberation Army. There are a lot of stories about the KLA, that it's associated with drug trafficking or prostitution or smuggling or terrorism. Now, you don't really have to believe that completely or even halfway. What you do have to see, I think, is that the KLA represents the armed expression of Kosovo Albanian independence. Now, unless we're going to endorse that, and perhaps some of you think that would be a good idea, but unless we are going to endorse that, and that's certainly not part of Western policy right now, that radical armed advocacy of Albanian independence somehow has got to be accommodated and got to be drawn into the mainstream. So what I'm saying here is that the demilitarization obligations or demilitarization clauses inside the peace proposals have got to be looked at very, very carefully and really, I think, turned into reality. Otherwise, we're going to be dealing with a group of people about whom we know really very little about the personalities at the top of the KLA, who are going to be asserting an agenda which is really in opposition to our own stated agenda. And that is going to be something which will lay the groundwork, I'm afraid, for more Balkan conflict, this time not concerning Serbia, but down a little further south, concerning Macedonia, concerning Montenegro, concerning parts of perhaps Greece, of Bulgaria, and certainly bringing Albania in, because that would be, I think, the effect of a radical movement achieving dominance inside the Kosovo Albanian population. Now, I'm going to sort of end up with a couple of sort of minor recommendations, and sometimes when I attend meetings in Washington, somebody always gets up and says, well, what do the mushy Europeans think about this? And I sort of raise my hand and chip in, and it really always does sound mushy, and I apologize for this in advance, but I think this is something that goes back to what I've been saying before, which is that we slightly got overhyped here. We slightly got the level of importance too high. I think we really, perhaps three things we've got to do. I think we've got to be even-handed. Somehow we've got to see that all sides have got to be brought to the table. All sides have got to be reconciled. This is not by any means, of course, this is quite apart from the issues before the International Criminal Tribunal, but basically all peoples involved in that part of the world have somehow got to be reconciled. That's got to be, that's even-handedness is that part of the deal. I think the other thing we've got to do is we've got to listen. We've got to listen more rather than dictating. There are, I think, several possible solutions available in Kosovo. The local people are talking about them that stop short of either independence on the one hand or Serbian domination on the other. You've got ideas about partition. I don't particularly think it's a good idea, but in a sense, it's not really for us to say that. If the people there can work out a deal, perhaps we ought to listen. There's other ideas for regionalization, for cantonization, for splitting things up municipality by municipality. These are the sort of things we should be listening to rather than coming in with our own ready-made solutions and trying to impose them on a very, very complex historical background. And I think the last thing I would say is that we've got to put politics first. Now, this is a political situation. It's a people-to-people problem. It's the sort of thing where I think Senator Mitchell, showed that he had very strong command of the sort of things that were necessary in Northern Ireland. And I think that's the sort of approach we'll have to move towards once the generals, who are obviously going to be in charge at least for the next few months, once they have left the scene, we've got to have that really political approach put back at the top of the agenda. Well, that's really my take. I just want to say that I really do hope that we're not dealing with a quagmire here. I very much, certainly one of the things we could be headed to, or we could be headed towards something which will last for a generation. On the other hand, I think that with sensible politics here, we could come out of this with the West's values and principles restored to the primacy they should be in. Thank you.
Well, we thank you for a splendid overview. Mr. Clarke is going to field the questions. He'll repeat them if you ask them from the floor, or if you'd like to go to the mics, you certainly may.
Mr. Clarke, in light of the Serb brutalities against the Albanian Kosovars, and assuming the Albanian Kosovars go back into Kosovo, won't they then seek to exact retribution against the Serbs? If so, won't the Serbs then flee Kosovo? And if so, won't there then be a de facto independent Kosovo? If so, how does how would NATO seek to maintain the sovereignty of Yugoslavia over Kosovo as part of the agreement of the conclusion of this affair?
Did everybody understand the question? The question is essentially that when the fighting concludes, won't the Kosovo Albanians who are going back to Kosovo have a right to exact retribution? Won't they actually, in fact, do that? And won't that, in fact, cause the Serbs entirely to leave Kosovo, thereby leaving the Kosovo empty of Serbs, and thereby creating a de facto independence for Kosovo? And what is NATO's role at that time? Well, I think that's absolutely a valid scenario, and I think that's why the mission of the NATO troops is going to be so very, very delicate when they enter, and this is why really I emphasize the point about the Kosovo Liberation Army, because I do believe that in fact there are a great number of moderate and very decent Albanians who are likely to want to go back to their homes and who will be able to, at least after perhaps 6 months or a year, come to some form of modus vivendi with the Serbs. If there are any Serbs left there, and that of course is a very good question, because you saw what happened in the last days of the Bosnian War, when there was large exchanges of population, large refugee flows, and people leaving the territories they saw their adversaries coming into. It is quite possible that all Serbs will leave there, and I think it will be incumbent on the international administration there try to entice them back. If that doesn't work, then as you say, we are dealing with de facto independence 3 or 4 years down the track. That's going to be something which is going to be extraordinarily difficult, I think, to handle. It's going to be impossible to handle if it's done in terms of an armed insurrection-led demand for independence, and therefore I think that this is what you really put your finger on is the challenge facing the NATO and international presence.
Okay. By your speech tonight, I had the impression that everything was done wrong. Of course, a lot of things were done wrong last 10 years, but you didn't mention about human sufferings. And for example, Václav Havel, who said this war is first war which is fought for human dignity. Second, maybe was this, like other people said, the right things to do but the wrong way. But third, how you have done differently, because you are so much criticizing everything, but you didn't have any answer concretely. What is the best to do? And fourth, I will add, what is the criteria if one ethnic group, which is in compact territory, make majority for self-determination?
I think I better confine myself to, there are so many questions there. If you don't mind, I'll confine myself to I think the most interesting one, aspect of it, which is what I would have done differently, because you rightly say it's easy to criticize, and what would you have done otherwise. My belief is that, I say the critical error was, in fact, to invest the whole Balkan unraveling of former Yugoslavia with far more importance than it was really worth. And we thereby came in there with an imposed settlement that we wanted, rather than, I think, which we do typically in all other situations around the world, rather than trying to mediate between the competing parties. And I think that had we done a little bit more mediation, a little bit less reaching for the trigger, I believe we would have a much better chance of coming out of this one more satisfactorily. I've already mentioned the one on Bosnia, the Lisbon Agreement of March 1992. Not satisfactory, not particularly fair, not particularly just, but I think something which would have spared the region the terrible ravages of 3 years of war. I think that coming up to the Kosovo situation, I think that on March 22nd, for example, we had a reasonable situation in Kosovo. We had the humanitarian relief organizations on the ground. We had the Kosovo monitoring mission that was coming in very slowly, unfortunately, from the West. The numbers were meant to be 2,000. They were only about 1,100. The situation was reasonably stable. And I think that by ramping up the situation and going in with trying to force a settlement which the situation was not really ripe for, I think has made ourselves destroyed the opportunity of time that might have been available at that time. And I think a much longer time span would have been better.
Can I add one? But you're talking like Milosevic had a normal person. He had a normal policy, and like two sides are normal, and you can negotiate. And you had 10 years which Albanian had like a peaceful movement, and no one reacted. And this is state which was breaking apart. And what is the role of international community to do? Sit and watch? Or?
Well, whatever the international community did, it's, I think, we've ended up in a highly unsatisfactory situation. The region is still on tenterhooks. The region is still highly unstable. So I don't think you can really say that what has actually happened has been in any way satisfactory. But what I do say is that I think there was an alternative. There was a greater patience. This is the sort of approach which we use typically in practically every other dispute that the West is involved in around the world. Certainly, for example, in Turkey, where the situation is perhaps at least as bad as in Kosovo. We would never dream of doing what we have done in Kosovo. And I think that's something which we perhaps ought to search our consciences about over the coming months.
This is one time when the time limit does have to apply, as opposed to the wisdom of applying it at Rambouillet. This has been a marvelous evening. I think it's a wonderfully comprehensive presentation, and your analysis was full and thought-provoking. We're deeply in debt to you. Thanks very much.